So Foxglove's existed for almost 2 years, so it's kind of an organization, an independent not-for-profit that has been working in this area all through the pandemic. That's kind of business as usual for you. How has the pandemic changed your mind about the sharing of data?
So I guess I'd answer that question in a couple of ways. Just to disclose my priors from my own childhood. I'm actually, although I'm a crunchy kind of lawyer, I'm actually the child of 2 research scientists. So my mother actually was an ophthalmic pharmaceutical researcher. My father was a geneticist. So if the question is whether I myself would participate in a patient study or a clinical trial, the answer is I absolutely would do that. But I think at Foxglove, the reason that we set up a couple of years ago, and I think that actually what's happened in the pandemic has confirmed what we felt, was a sense that power, a kind of data power, was being exercised over people, that more and more information was being collected about us, not just in the health context, but in migration, police, business, grades, and being used to influence or make decisions in ways that people weren't asked about, that people didn't understand, and that people wouldn't necessarily accept. So if the question is, do I think that the pandemic has kind of created a social license or a democratic mandate for a kind of data free-for-all, then I think the answer is absolutely no. And actually, I kind of wanted to tell a story about trust and health data. Can I do that?
Go for it.
Yeah. So I came to see all of you today on the tube from my local neighborhood of Brixton. And for the past several months, I don't know how many of you know Brixton or hang out much in Brixton, but anyway, there's been a guy outside the tube station. It's like kind of once a week, pretty often, particularly during the summer as I was getting my jab and my second jab. And he had a sound system, and sometimes some dancers, and he had a really catchy rap that he played, for several months on end, off and on. And it really caught me up short the first time I cycled past it, and I stopped and I listened. And it basically says, brothers, sisters, don't get the vaccine, don't get the vaccine, don't get the vaccine. At first I thought he was saying, go get the vaccine, and I was really excited. But anyway, that was definitely, in the end, no, it was just one of your classic cases of paranoia. But I tell the story, if you go, and then the data bears out that rap. It's an anecdote, but actually if you go and you look at the government's dashboard for the percentage of people who have gone forward for their second jab, in Brixton, my little neighborhood, you're looking at 50-something% of people who have gone for their second jab. So really running behind the national average by about 20%. And that's for all kinds of historical reasons to do with people's trust in government, people's trust in research, people's trust in businesses. And I think actually from my perspective, when it talks about sharing data, I think the lesson that I take away from the pandemic is you can't have public health without doing work to repair public trust.
So you highlight, I guess, an inherent mistrust from certain communities in government. But if you look at 2017, the Digital Economy Act gave the government new powers to share data and predominantly touted the need for more efficiency, public sector reform. I mean, we spend almost £1 billion on census every 10 years, much of which potentially could be achieved by linking up government data. So why isn't this progress? I mean, I think Dame Fiona Caldicott even said in '97, the duty to share information could be as important as the duty to protect confidentiality. Do we not just need to get with the plan here and all support the government to be more effective and more efficient in the way it delivers public services by sharing our data?
I mean, I've definitely seen some people on social media, including, I'm afraid, in the health research community, who basically express that sentiment, which is to say people need to just shut up, get with the program, and take their medicine, right? People don't know what's good for them. I think it depends, doesn't it? I think, and actually, if you look at things like patient juries that have been had, kind of umpteen patient juries, including that the government paid for the past several years, about how people feel about sharing health data in particular, actually, most people want to feel safe to contribute. Like if you ask, say, how do you feel about data being used for your own direct care? People are actually pretty surprised to learn that actually data across your care journey through the NHS isn't more joined up, and that actually maybe the hospital hasn't got everything that it wants. And people, of course, understand and expect that there will be more efficient use of data in that context. Then you talk about planning, which is, I think, one of the state uses that you're talking about. And people are broadly in favor, I think, of better use within the NHS system for planning and commissioning. Then you ask them questions about research. And actually, you get a little bit of a drop-off, but lots of people are like me who say they'd like to sign, they might well sign up for academic research or things like that. Pretty consistently, the finding is that trust drops off once you start to talk about commercial research. And partly that's because of the value that people place on the NHS as a publicly funded health service, and they're concerned about the idea of the NHS potentially being taken for a ride by a company, or that the company might not be trustworthy, et cetera.
So can you cite an example where you've seen that happen? I mean, research teams are not black or white. Often they'll be made up of private and public sector teams working together.
Indeed.
Can you think of an example where you've seen that happen?
I have like an entire page of examples, and I promise not to read you 72 examples of untrustworthy uses of patient data. So I'm trying to think which ones I most want to talk about. So let's do one with health data that happened in the United States. So for several years, there was an algorithm used to triage patients in a company called Optum and United Health that was supposed to flag who might need more urgent care and so forth, right? And really help make the hospital run more efficiency. And it was in place for a couple of years in hospitals, so really triaged and affected the care journey of some millions of American patients. And then a couple of independent data scientists went and kind of crunched the numbers and ran the figures, and lo and behold, it turned out the algorithm had systematically been under-recommending equally sick Black people for care interventions, basically because there was an economic element in terms of what the cost of things was supposed to be.
Yep.
And look, a data scientist found it. Let's be clear. The data then led to the repair of the system, but for understandable kind of reasons of politics and history, that wasn't found until the thing had been running for years and years and years and years. Or let's talk about Google for a minute. So in the United States, there was a program called Project Nightingale. Are you familiar with that one?
Yep.
Where they acquired tens of millions of, and by the way, identifiable, right? Not even the kind of pseudonymization exercise, right? But identifiable patient records, which they still have and are developing products and services over it. And I just think that people can reasonably differ about whether they want their full patient record going in to let a company of the size and political power and infrastructural power of Google to move into the health space.
Well, so you talk about kind of patient data and making it de-identifiable. Obviously, there is no such thing as anonymized data because it only takes certain data sets to be linked to your data set for it to become visible and identifiable. In the UK, we confusingly now have the general practice data for planning and research, not another form of GDPR, but something that your organization brought to precipitation over the summer and has, if you like, extended the public debate upon this. That they've claimed that's going to be de-identified data, but talk to us about the small print there, because there's some element of, for legal purposes, it talks about it could be potentially made identifiable for legal purposes. Where do you draw the line?
So I don't know how many people in the audience know about the kind of GP data plan, so maybe it's worth just saying the top line what it was. So in the late spring, on a corner of the NHS digital website, a new move was announced to take everybody's GP record and put it into a centralized pool. This was called, confusingly, as you say, the GPDPR, not the GDPR, but the GPDPR. Anyway, general practice data for planning and research. It was going to go into a central pool that was supposed to be used for a whole bunch of use cases. So your care, but also planning and commissioning, and also research, including potentially commercial research. But they hadn't said very much at all about, let's say, what public benefit standard was going to be applied to determine which companies would be able to access this information and for what purposes. And I guess we in the coalition that we work with, who represented a huge range of organizations. It was Doctors Association UK, the National Pensioners Convention, because of course loads of pensioners were not online and probably had not read the notice on NHS Digital's website. Randomly, David Davis MP, a sort of civil libertarian conservative MP, who has mainly worked on government surveillance issues in this context. Anyway, lots of people came together, and we were concerned that there had been no meaningful public debate about this new centralization and what standards would apply and who would get the keys to the proverbial kingdom. So anyway, we kind of threatened a judicial review, and the government then kind of extended the deadline and now has sort of indefinitely paused the scheme until a few qualitative tests are met, it says. Now, we actually don't want the baby to go out with the bathwater. I think we'd like to see a new system or a new version come forward and take its place that is actually more transparent, more democratically accountable to people, more responsive to patients and their concerns.
So when you say a new system,
yeah,
do you mean a consultation process, or do you mean, as we often talk about internally and externally at the Open Data Institute, talk about data institutions, organizations that are stewarding data for public and social purposes? I mean, what do you mean by a system?
I think that there probably is a need for, I know governance is not the sexiest word and always the sexiest topic, but to go back to what I was saying about trust, I think that there are one, the government now knows this. So just to go back to this GPDPR, the number of opt-outs, you can see this on their dashboard, apparently doubled in the period that this debate was happening in May, June, July. So it's now I think 4 million or 5, really significant percentage of people who have signed the national data opt-out. Now, I don't know if any data scientists are in here, but the complaint the government has about this is that it skews your sample, that it skews the representativeness of the sample and makes the data set on the whole less valuable. So we've got to fix this problem of trust, actually, if we're going to go forward and if the ambition is to have population-wide health data research in this country. And so, yes, I think that there is, so that's all by way of saying, yes, I think that there does need to be some new governance model for access to health data that actually is much more accessible to the layperson than the systems currently exist. There's something called iGuard. You can go and read its minutes online, but they are not transparent even to the reasonably informed person, much less to the random expert. So yes, I think the other thing I would say is that trust doesn't necessarily scale that well. So I've been talking to kind of health data researchers over the past 6 months to a year about what the right aperture or community size is for kind of pooling data for this. And some people say actually it might be better to do it on a metropolitan level or a regional level, like 8 or 9, like one London did some data pooling. Yeah. And so then you think, well, if it's a regional level, why can't you have something, I don't know, kind of like a school board where you've got an interdisciplinary group of people that, yes, scientists and data scientists and researchers, yes, clinicians, but also maybe somebody or somebodies who are responsive to the electorate and can be thrown out on their ear if a major data access problem happens. And then, of course, patients and people.
So you're almost saying apply the kind of private sector GDPR type penalties to people accountable in civil service almost for the misuse of that data potentially.
Well, I'm not, although of course you can hear from my accent, I am American, and I do come from a place where civil servants can be sued in their personal capacity for money. That's actually not what I was proposing. Okay. I'm not saying that they should have to pay like a potential personal fine so much as that somebody has got to be somebody who's responsive to the electorate. Then if there is let's say a scandal in which Philip Morris, who has acquired the inhaler company, which they have done, and then comes in as given access to patient data in a way that without people having a chance to debate it in any way, potentially they can be voted out.
It might not be fines, but they need to be accountable.
Yeah, some more accountability. No, and to be honest, when you're talking about entities the size of Google, what fine is a meaningful deterrent? You tell me. Well, what level of fine is a meaningful deterrent?
I guess, your organization focuses on big tech. We talked about governments a bit. We haven't so much talked about big tech. But I think you've mentioned the US. The concept of communities having more ownership and access around their data is something that has been popping up in parts of Europe. Some data commons communities emerging in places like Barcelona. Do you see that model as something that could work if you get areas of a metropolitan city? I mean, London's globally quite a small city now, but it is still, as you say, 10 to 12 million records is pretty representative. Could that work? Could this kind of models of local community ownership of the data that is about them to inform decisions and support services around them, could that work, that type of?
That's what we're really interested in seeing, kind of that people come forward and develop. Yeah, and actually, I think some of that work was done in the, I mean, not in terms of research exactly, but with something like the One London system here, where there were a whole bunch of patient juries, conversations about both public and private access to patient data, and there is some pooling now across the London metro area of data. There is greater sharing. I think at the moment, there's probably somebody here from One London who will correct me, but I think at the moment most of the data is read-only, so it's not all singing, all dancing. It doesn't do everything that everybody would want it to do. But that was a pre-pandemic system, actually, that people were setting up to try and improve the data picture within the health service. I think the other thing we've got to be honest about when we're talking about trust and who people trust and why, is that we're all sitting here in this room talking about trustworthy data governance against a backdrop of a government whose own paper, Data: A New Direction, basically talks about taking the data laws that we have, the GDPR, which already kind of leaks like a sieve anyway, and just firing a whole bunch more holes in it.
Well, so there's you're getting onto the subject now, which is cropped up a lot recently. I think Wired produced an article on the 1st of September looking at the risk. I mean, much has been made of the UK's desperate position to try and secure trade deals, and is the NHS data on the table for those? I mean, what price does progress need to pay?
I don't know about all of you, but I am personally quite tired of being governed by 3-word slogans like "Get Brexit Done" or "Data Saves Lives," which was the slogan that the government walked out during the debate about GP data. Because the truth is, if you look at the papers from, let's say, Liam Fox and Trades Notes in Davos to chat with Palantir and other tech executives, yes, data can save lives, but data can also make quite a lot of people quite a lot of money. And it's really clear that the NHS's data is like a huge part of the UK's kind of post-Brexit industrial strategy. Now, again, views can reasonably differ, I think, about the extent to which we want to take this. As I understand it, the NHS is sitting on top of, because of the way that GP codes, for example, are encoded, the biggest set of relatively structured, relatively machine-readable, longitudinal health data kind of anywhere. So that's, I guess, an asset. But who should have access and on what terms, and whose standard of public benefit are we going to apply?
But the UK,
yours, mine,
the UK is a hotbed for health tech companies. And is at the cusp of needing to prove it can trade in different parts of the world in different ways and can grow. I mean, let's face it, it's certainly not in the growth rate it was many years ago in the 50s, and we now live in a kind of era of global rivalry between China and the US. Is the UK's ability to leverage its massive unstructured health data in a safe and secure way not an appropriate price to put on helping it drive economic growth and innovation?
I mean, I think the answer to that question is probably yes. The question is whether that's what's happening, isn't it? So I think, or whether in fact what's happening with things like binning GDPR is whether, and adding loads of exceptions, whether actually we're going to become a place that trades in a deregulatory environment, and whether in the hope that that will kind of spur innovation. And by the way, there are economic costs potentially to a massive deregulation of data. I realize that data protection is in some ways the least sexy topic in the English language. Like GDPR needs, as much as anything else, a rebrand, right? I mean, can you think of any less sexy phrase than data protection?
How would you rebrand it? What would you call it?
I think it's the kind of thing that keeps on, in your data world, the chlorine out of your chicken. But I realize that doesn't quite work. I don't know. I don't know. This is no better, but the phrase I always really liked, there's a German throwback, a legal concept that kind of was the forebear to data protection, which was called, and it's one word in German apparently, but it's called informational self-determination, which I accept that's not better from a branding standpoint, but from a conceptual standpoint, the thing I like about that is that it's about your ability to go forward into the world on your own terms.
Yep.
It's different from privacy, right? It's not about turning away and hiding. It's about you having the power to decide who's got what information about you.
Yeah.
Anyhow, we slightly lost train of thought. Something about Brexit, regulatory arbitration. Oh, well, look, if we lose equivalency, by the way, it's going to cost us some money. Like, I have to cheat. I have to look at my cheat sheet now. Apparently, the government's figures on the value to the UK of data flows to the EU, 85 billion, 13% of our trade. If you lose equivalency, it's not great.
Well, Oliver Dowden also highlighted in an article earlier this year or even end of last year, the opportunity for data sharing agreements between different jurisdictions.
Sure.
And I think if you look at places like Singapore and Malaysia, perhaps not the kind of gold standards that we would want to reference, but they are nations which have built economic trade at pace through sharing data. Is that an opportunity for the UK?
Potentially, yes. But it's got to be done in a way that is democratically acceptable to people, and I think that doesn't leave people open to various
So the UK was I think the first country to launch a universal beneficial ownership register for sharing data on companies. And that can sometimes be a sensitive area because often information on directors of companies will be published openly. I mean, this, I guess, moving away from the pandemic for a second, we always try and get people to think about data as infrastructure at the Open Data Institute. Do you think that approach is one that...
Tell me more about it.
Well, it just as you have roads and rail, and we take for granted the traffic lights, that you will stop at the traffic lights, and certainly if you're in this country, you would drive on the left-hand side of the road. All of that stuff becomes accepted because it is standards. I mean, I think Robert Louis Stevenson's rocket engine ran over someone because there wasn't standardized safety procedures and practices. All those things we take for granted, and they are invested in, whether that's at a tax government level or whether that's through... I mean, should we not be thinking about data as a kind of liquid infrastructure that flows across everything we do and needs an underlying of investment?
So I think actually I would agree with that. And actually one of the kind of shortcomings of the GDPR, although I would quite like not to see it thrown entirely in the bin, is that it's so individualistic that so much of it has to do with individual consent and choice. And actually what you're talking about is a trustworthy infrastructure. Like I don't want to have to, like the tap, right? When I turn on my tap, I want to trust that if I shove my glass in there, the water's going to come out and I can drink it. And similarly, I think with health data, people would like to trust in the system and know that when they sit down and they talk to your GP, that the people who will then be, let's say, accessing information from that conversation are people that they are trustworthy without having necessarily to kind of go through a tick box consent form for every single use case all of the time. But to do that, again, that requires us getting the governance right.
So we were going to switch to big tech for a second. We've gone back to government for a minute. I mean, aren't we all just hooked on using big tech browsers, giving up our data willy-nilly? I mean, I'm sure many people in the room, I myself, have used private browsers and sometimes think about that. And I know for a fact, as I follow things like DuckDuckGo, one of the kind of anonymized search engines, it's massively grown. I think it's one of the fastest growing kind of search tools out there. At what point do we kind of get off the crack of giving our data to these big tech companies? Do we not have a responsibility? It's all very well to bash them and say, well, but ultimately we kind of depend on them too, right? They have a lot of the talent and the horsepower to do stuff with the data.
I can't get anywhere without Google Maps. I'll be absolutely honest. But look, this is the.
You could use OpenStreetMap.
Is it good? Because let's be honest, some of these more junior tech tools are not always as good as effective. Look, that's where I slightly part company with lovely Shoshana Zuboff, because she says, how have they become so dominant? Like, is what they offer of any value? Like, if it didn't offer anything of any value, it would not have literally swallowed the planet, right? Like that's clear. But I also think that people, this is the conversation you always have with your grumpy uncle at dinner, isn't it? Like, well, people don't care anymore. They don't care about their privacy. I'm from Texas. They just go on to the social media and they put it there so they don't care. That's just not true. It's just that the massive dominance of the companies is such that people think that they don't have any choice. That's actually a failure of regulation. So let's take a recent example from earlier this year. WhatsApp. owned by Facebook, like everything. And they kind of pushed out a notice to all of their users saying, oh, by the way, if you want to continue to use WhatsApp, your data, a whole bunch of your data is going to be shared with Facebook. Your use is conditional. Suddenly, boom, overnight, downloads of Signal, they crashed Signal's website. Downloads of Signal kind of absolutely shot through the roof. It became the kind of #1 messaging app in the App Store, not only kind of around here, but I think in India and a whole bunch of other places. So when you offer people a choice for a less invasive version of the service, people vote with their feet. They're not shy about voting with their feet. It's just that at the moment we have, for kind of 15 years, had a really deregulatory market that has allowed a handful of players to amass a level of information about people. I mean, was that kid 15? How old was the WannaCry kid? Anybody remember? Anyway, I mean, look, if a teenager can cause that level of infrastructural havoc, then obviously there is a need to lock some stuff down better than it currently is. My slightly dim understanding of the way that the data is currently held, let's say in GP systems, is that there's basically 2 providers, and that actually quite a lot of the material is not as secure as you might think. So yeah, there probably is a need for a little bit of an upgrade. But you're right that hand on my heart, I'm not a computer scientist, I'm just a lawyer. And so I tend to think about it from the perspective also of, as it were, the authorized access that is problematic. But yes, there was, and that was one of the things that was really motivating David Davis MP's intervention in our case, and his participant in our case, was a sense that they hadn't sorted out the kind of cybersecurity of it either. And people do care about that, of course. Nobody wants their health. I think health is different for people because it's so, it's
personal, it's intimate.
It's so personal to people.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you. I don't know if I have a clear answer to that. 2 years ago when we were setting up, we felt that there was a kind of gap in the space, and that there was still quite a, how would I put it? Quite a consensual space. So it's not that people didn't grapple with questions around trust and data, but there was a kind of sense that actually if Stuart and I could sort it out on the right panel stage, then it would probably be okay, right? As opposed to injecting kind of the idea that power is at play here, and there's going to be some necessary conflict, and actually that's part of a healthy democracy, right? So we set ourselves up partly to inject some conflict into the space. Why is it different in the States? I think partly because the United States is a more, a slightly more chest-beating, open society about things that it's doing wrong. So if I think about some of the American lawyers that I observed bringing cases about one or another algorithmic system that had hurt people, they knew about it because somebody told them, because somebody was pretty open about what they were doing. So there's some lovely, I think the guy's in Arkansas, Kevin DeLeban. He did one where an algorithm had cut people's care hours and kind of in half. And basically the care worker visited people's homes. It's like, I'm sorry, I can't do this because the algorithm has told me, it's reduced my hours. And so I think for a long time, people here felt they couldn't get purchase on the issues because they didn't know that the power was being exercised. And so I guess but when people see the power being exercised, the magic is they then act to take it back.